Hi boys and girls, this is Miss Simpson here and welcome back to another video of our Read Aloud series of the book The BFG by Roald Dahl. So I like to start off our videos by doing a quick recap of what we've learned so far in our story and then continuing on with our reading to find out what comes next in the book. So in our story, the BFG, we learned that there are different characters. We learned that there are humans and that there are giants. We learned that there is an orphan girl named Sophie. And we learned that she was up in the middle of the night looking out the window and she saw a big, mysterious creature. She saw it walking along the streets, but she wasn't sure what it was. She got frightened. And that's where we left off so far. So our prediction was, what did you guys think about the giant? So today we're going to continue on with our story. We're going to read a few more chapters. I hope that you enjoy. And hopefully we're going to find out some more about that giant creature that we saw or heard about coming in the nighttime. So we're going to start off, the chapter is called The Snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice, and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There, at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk. And the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. So as you can see, imagine that arm, that hand, the size of a tree trunk coming towards you in your bed. Oh, make my blood turn to ice too. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and a dangerous eye, had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all the four corners of it in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down High Street. He was running so fast, his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path, and he crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came to Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he's hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. The next chapter is called The Cave. The giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in the way of his running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or over sea. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that even she had to duck down into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the black blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest and then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and a pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around. And dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it in the sky was gushing and glistening light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side, the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out, and he paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive red stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He is getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place, and Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the cave corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in on his legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals, and that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at each end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through the thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. And that is the end of the chapter. The next chapter is called the BFG. So your question for your written response for these chapters is going to be, what do you think is going to happen next? So this is similar to our last question. Our last question was to make a prediction about what kind of giant. Now we know that he took her somewhere. We know that she's shaking, she's trembling with fear. She's cold as ice. She doesn't know where she is. What do you think is going to happen next? So I'd like you to describe in at least 1 or 2 sentences. Tell me, what do you think is going to happen next? Do you think Sophie's going to escape? Do you think the giant is going to reveal himself? Do you think he's going to eat her? What do you think is going to happen next? So I look forward to having you join us for our next video as we continue on with our reading of the story, The BFG. I cannot wait to see your responses and hear what you think is going to happen next in our story. And I hope that you enjoyed our chapters from today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you next time as we continue reading The BFG by Roald Dahl. Bye!